Payne Ryan Carter never imagined that his reputation as a war hero would bring him to this moment. He had faced countless battles, survived the deadliest of missions, and earned medals of honor. But none of that prepared him for the strange summons he received from the Zrithalon Empire. A diplomatic meeting was about to take place, and he, a human soldier, was invited to represent his people. It wasn't a friendly invitation. It was a political move, a gesture of goodwill to solidify the fragile peace treaty between the humans and the Zrithalians. Ryan's shuttle landed on the lush alien world of Zrithalon. Towering spires and floating platforms welcomed him, and he could feel the weight of history in the air. The Zrithalians were technologically advanced, their civilization built on millennia of progress. But for all their brilliance, one thing was clear: they still had their own set of problems. One of those problems stood before him now: Princess Zyra. Ryan stood at the edge of a massive balcony, looking out over the bustling capital. The king's palace was grand, and the gardens below were unlike anything he had seen on Earth. But his thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the royal ceremony that awaited him. He didn't trust the Zrithalians. He didn't trust anyone who thought a fragile peace could last forever. Ryan's mind raced with questions. What was King Valthar thinking? Why had they chosen him, of all people, for this mission? The grand doors of the palace opened, and there, standing in front of him, was King Valthar, the ruler of Zrithalon. His towering figure was cloaked in royal armor, and his glowing green eyes looked cold and calculating. But it wasn't the king who caught Ryan's attention, it was the woman beside him. Princess Zyra. She had silver hair that shimmered under the palace lights, and her skin glowed a deep violet, a stark contrast to Ryan's own pale human complexion. But it wasn't just her looks that stood out. It was the fire in her eyes, the defiance in her stance. Zyra wasn't a typical princess. She was rebellious, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge her father's rule. The rumors about her were everywhere. A brilliant mind with a dangerous temper, someone who would stop at nothing to reshape the galaxy, even if it meant burning bridges. King Valthar spoke first, his voice calm and steady. "Captain Carter," he began, his words clipped. "I have a gift for you." Ryan raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. He had heard the word gift in many different contexts before, but never in such a serious military setting. "A gift," Ryan repeated, his voice cautious. He knew better than to trust these powerful beings. A gift could mean anything, and in a place like Zrithalon, it usually meant something far more complicated than it seemed. The king's expression hardened, his gaze moving to his daughter. "This is Princess Zyra," he said, as though everyone should know who she was. "She has caused great distress to the stability of my reign, and now I'm offering her as a gift to you. It is a punishment for her actions." Ryan's stomach dropped. The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment, time itself stood still. The last thing he had expected was a princess as a gift, especially one known for defying her father's rule. Zyra's eyes locked onto Ryan's. She stood tall, her violet skin shimmering with anger. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out sharp and defiant. "I would rather die than be handed over to you, human," she spat. Her voice was laced with venom, filled with a deep hatred for him and everything he represented. Ryan took a step forward, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his weapon, though he knew he wouldn't use it. He had no intention of engaging in violence, not yet. He had come here to negotiate, to bring peace, not to become entangled in political games. The princess's words cut deeper than he expected. She wasn't just angry at her father. She was angry at him too. The idea of a human soldier, especially one who had fought against her people, now being handed control of her future, was more than she could stomach. "What makes you think I would want anything to do with you?" Ryan asked, trying to keep his voice even. He wasn't one to show emotion easily, especially not in front of an alien king and his daughter. "Fine," she muttered, turning away from him. "But don't expect me to be your ally." You're nothing to me. Ryan nodded. He had no intention of forcing her to be an ally, but it was clear that something needed to change between them if they were going to survive whatever came next. She had power, he had skill. Together, they might just stand a chance. But for now, all he could do was focus on the mission at hand. Over the next few days, the two of them were forced into close proximity, much to Zura's displeasure. Every time Ryan tried to speak to her, she shot him down, either with a sharp remark or with a cold silence. It was obvious she hated being in his presence, but Ryan wasn't about to give up. There was something about Zyra that intrigued him. Despite her rebellion, despite the walls she had built around herself, there was a fire in her that he couldn't ignore. One evening, they were forced to take shelter in a remote location after their transport was attacked by rogue Zerthalian warlords. The attack was sudden, and they barely escaped with their lives. The rogue Zerthalians, with their advanced weapons and cloaking technology, had ambushed them in the dead of night. Ryan had never seen enemies move so quickly, their attacks so precise. If it hadn't been for Zura's quick thinking, they both might have been killed. Not bad for a princess, Ryan said, a small smile tugging at his lips as he wiped the sweat from his brow. They had fought side by side, and Zura had proven herself more than capable. Zura didn't respond right away. She was sitting on a rock, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ryan thought she might snap at him again, but instead, she simply nodded. "I don't need your praise," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "But you're not terrible either." Ryan felt a strange sense of pride at her words, though he tried not to show it. "Guess we make a good team after all," he said. Zura stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. "Don't get used to it, human. This doesn't mean I'm trusting you." The next day, as they continued their journey, Ryan realized that Zyra's attitude toward him had shifted, even if just a little. She was still fiercely independent, still hated being under his command. But there was a quiet respect between them now. For the first time since they met, Ryan felt like he might actually have a chance of making this partnership work. If he could just keep his cool and not give in to the tension that was constantly building between them, maybe they could both survive this. But deep down, Ryan knew it wouldn't be easy. Zura was a force to be reckoned with, and so was he. Their wills were clashing, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way for them to find common ground. They were both survivors, and if they didn't find a way to work together, there was no telling what would happen next. The days passed in a tense silence between Captain Ryan Carter and Princess Zyra. They had barely exchanged words since their close call with the rogue Zerthalians. Ryan had expected their uneasy truce to last longer, but it was clear that Zyra was struggling to adjust to being in his company. She still looked at him with distrust, and Ryan had no illusions about the strength of their alliance. They were only forced to cooperate because they had no other choice. The two of them were traveling through the barren, desolate lands of Zrithalon, a planet full of deep ravines and dark forests. The landscape had been a reminder of how hostile this world could be. And while they had faced some dangerous situations before, something felt different now. It was as if the calm they had felt during their brief period of rest was just the calm before a storm. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the distance, a shadow moving through the trees just out of the corner of his eye. At first, Ryan dismissed it as nothing more than the natural dangers of the alien world. But the unease never left him. He knew when something wasn't right. He had been trained for this, had survived battles far more dangerous than a simple hike through an alien forest. Zyra, as usual, seemed oblivious to the tension. She walked ahead, her posture stiff and proud, completely unaware of the danger that Ryan felt creeping closer. As a princess, she had always been protected, surrounded by guards, and her world was one of luxury and safety. She had never learned to trust her instincts like Ryan had, never been in situations where danger lurked around every corner. "Fine," she muttered, turning away from him. "But don't expect me to be your ally. You're nothing to me." Ryan nodded. He had no intention of forcing her to be an ally, but it was clear that something needed to change between them if they were going to survive whatever came next. She had power, he had skill. Together, they might just stand a chance. But for now, all he could do was focus on the mission at hand. Over the next few days, the two of them were forced into close proximity, much to Zura's displeasure. Every time Ryan tried to speak to her, she shot him down, either with a sharp remark or with a cold silence. It was obvious she hated being in his presence, but Ryan wasn't about to give up. There was something about Zyra that intrigued him. Despite her rebellion, despite the walls she had built around herself, there was a fire in her that he couldn't ignore. One evening, they were forced to take shelter in a remote location after their transport was attacked by rogue Zerthalian warlords. The attack was sudden, and they barely escaped with their lives. The rogue Zerthalians, with their advanced weapons and cloaking technology, had ambushed them in the dead of night. Ryan had never seen enemies move so quickly, their attacks so precise. If it hadn't been for Zura's quick thinking, they both might have been killed. "Not bad for a princess," Ryan said, a small smile tugging at his lips as he wiped the sweat from his brow. They had fought side by side, and Zura had proven herself more than capable. Zura didn't respond right away. She was sitting on a rock, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ryan thought she might snap at him again, but instead, she simply nodded. "I don't need your praise," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "But you're not terrible either." Ryan felt a strange sense of pride at her words, though he tried not to show it. "Guess we make a good team after all," he said. Zura stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. "Don't get used to it, human. This doesn't mean I'm trusting you." The next day, as they continued their journey, Ryan realized that Zyra's attitude toward him had shifted, even if just a little. She was still fiercely independent, still hated being under his command. But there was a quiet respect between them now. For the first time since they met, Ryan felt like he might actually have a chance of making this partnership work. If he could just keep his cool and not give in to the tension that was constantly building between them, maybe they could both survive this. But deep down, Ryan knew it wouldn't be easy. Zura was a force to be reckoned with, and so was he. Their wills were clashing, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way for them to find common ground. They were both survivors, and if they didn't find a way to work together, there was no telling what would happen next. The days passed in a tense silence between Captain Ryan Carter and Princess Zura. They had barely exchanged words since their close call with the rogue Zerthalians. Ryan had expected their uneasy truce to last longer, but it was clear that Zura was struggling to adjust to being in his company. She still looked at him with distrust, and Ryan had no illusions about the strength of their alliance. They were only forced to cooperate because they had no other choice. The two of them were traveling through the barren, desolate lands of Zrithalon, a planet full of deep ravines and dark forests. The landscape had been a reminder of how hostile this world could be, and while they had faced some dangerous situations before, something felt different now. It was as if the calm they had felt during their brief period of rest was just the calm before a storm. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the distance, a shadow moving through the trees just out of the corner of his eye. At first, Ryan dismissed it as nothing more than the natural dangers of the alien world. But the unease never left him. He knew when something wasn't right. He had been trained for this, had survived battles far more dangerous than a simple hike through an alien forest. Zura, as usual, seemed oblivious to the tension. She walked ahead, her posture stiff and proud, completely unaware of the danger that Ryan felt creeping closer. As a princess, she had always been protected, surrounded by guards, and her world was one of luxury and safety. She had never learned to trust her instincts like Ryan had, never been in situations where danger lurked around every corner. His eyes scanned the cavern, his mind racing. Whatever was waiting for them, they needed to escape, and fast. But how? He wasn't going to get out of this on his own, and Zira was still somewhere in the darkness. Ryan wasn't about to leave her behind. His mind worked quickly. There had to be something in the cavern that could help them. That's when he noticed it. A series of old, rusted pipes running along the walls. If he could somehow use them to his advantage, maybe he could create a distraction long enough to escape. As the creature lunged again, Ryan fired another shot, then sprinted toward the pipes. He could hear the growls getting closer, and the sound of more creatures closing in. The trap was tightening around them. But as he reached the pipes, he heard a voice. Zyra's voice, weak but determined. "I'm not dead yet, human." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping to find her. And now he had. "We're not alone," he shouted. "Get to the pipes. We need to move. Now." The hidden threat was closer than they realized. They had fallen into a deadly trap, and only by working together would they make it out alive. But time was running out, and the creatures weren't the only danger they faced. Something far worse was watching them, ready to strike. Ryan's heart raced as the creatures closed in. He had barely enough time to grab Zira's arm and pull her away from the danger. She was still weak from the fall, but her sharp eyes were already scanning the underground cavern, taking in their surroundings. They had no choice but to work together. They were in a deadly situation now, and it was clear that survival depended on their ability to trust each other, something neither of them had been willing to do until now. The growls from the creatures were getting louder, echoing off the cavern walls. Ryan glanced behind them, the creatures still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. There were too many to fight off with just his gun, and the way they moved so silently, like predators stalking their prey, made him realize that running wasn't an option either. "Do you have a plan?" Zyra asked, her voice low but steady, even in the face of danger. She was clearly trying to control her fear, but Ryan could see the tension in her posture. She wasn't used to being in situations like this. Neither of them were. They had both been trained for battles, but not for situations like this. Being trapped underground with a hidden threat closing in. "I'm working on it," Ryan replied, keeping his voice calm. The last thing he needed was to sound panicked. He knew that if he lost his cool, Zyra would lose hers too, and that would make their chances of survival even slimmer. He scanned their surroundings again, thinking quickly. The cavern was huge, with tall, jagged rocks rising like sentinels from the floor. There were no obvious exits, just tunnels that seemed to disappear deeper into the earth. His mind raced, trying to find something they could use to escape, but everything around them was old, rusted, or covered in strange markings. It didn't seem like this place had been used in centuries. It felt abandoned, yet someone or something had made sure they ended up here. It didn't make sense. "What are you thinking?" Zyra asked, stepping closer to him. She looked at the pipes on the wall, then at the shadows that seemed to move with purpose. She was finally starting to see what Ryan had been feeling since they landed in this pit, the unsettling sensation that they were being watched. "We need to move, find a way out of here," Ryan said, his voice sharp. "But we can't go blindly running. We need a plan. Stay close." Zyra didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face hardening into a mask of determination. Ryan felt a flicker of something in his chest, something he hadn't expected from her. It was respect. She was trusting him, even if just a little. And in that moment, he realized that maybe they could do this together, if they worked side by side. Ryan moved toward the nearest pipe, his eyes still scanning the shadows. The growls were closer now, and the flickering sounds of claws scraping against stone told him the creatures were almost upon them. There was no time to waste. Ryan's mind raced, his thoughts bouncing between possibilities. He knew they were trapped in a dead end. The only way out was forward, but the creatures were everywhere. His hand instinctively reached for his weapon, the cold steel of the gun comforting him. But he knew it wasn't enough. It wasn't going to stop the horde of creatures closing in on them. "I've got an idea," Ryan said, a grim look crossing his face. "But it's risky." Zyra turned to him, her brow furrowed. "I'm listening," she said, her voice laced with both curiosity and caution. "We set a trap," Ryan began, his mind working fast. "I'll need you to help me lure them into the open. Once they're in position, I'll set off an explosion. The blast will collapse part of the tunnel and hopefully trap them. If we're lucky, it'll buy us enough time to escape." Zira looked at him, unsure at first. "You're asking me to trust you again," she said, a hint of disbelief in her tone. Ryan nodded. "I know it's dangerous, but it's our only shot." For a long moment, Zira didn't respond. She stared at him, as though weighing the risks in her mind. Ryan could see the doubt in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something that told him she was ready to do this. They were in this together now, for better or worse. Finally, she spoke. "Fine. I'll help. But you better be sure this works." Ryan gave her a small nod of appreciation. "I am." With a deep breath, they both began to move. The plan was simple but dangerous. Ryan knew that the explosion could kill them both if something went wrong, but it was the only option they had left. As they moved through the narrow tunnels, their footsteps were soft but hurried. Every corner they rounded brought them closer to the creatures, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. They came to a small chamber, a perfect spot for their trap. The walls were lined with strange, ancient machinery, and Ryan could see a few rusty pipes jutting out from the floor. He glanced at Zira, signaling her to take position. "You ready?" he asked, his voice tense. Zira nodded. "Let's do this." Ryan moved quickly, setting up the explosives near the base of the pipes. He carefully placed the detonator, making sure it was connected to the trigger. The plan was to use the explosion to not only collapse the tunnel, but also create a barrier that would separate the creatures from them. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, Zira moved to a higher position, a vantage point where she could lure the creatures into the trap. She was quick and silent, moving with the grace of someone who had spent her life in the shadows. Ryan watched her, admiring her ability to adapt to the situation. She was more than just a rebellious alien princess. She was a survivor. He gave her one last look before taking his position behind the machinery. His finger hovered over the detonator, ready to strike. He knew it would be risky, but they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The creatures were getting closer, their growls reverberating through the walls. The first creature appeared from the shadows, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. Zira stepped into view, just enough to draw its attention. The creature's eyes locked onto her, its mouth curling into a snarl as it began to stalk toward her. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They had to make this work. Zira moved quickly, dodging the creature's advances with the agility of a trained warrior. She baited it, leading it directly toward the trap. Ryan could hear the creatures closing in from all sides, their growls getting louder and more menacing. It was almost too late. "Now!" Ryan shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. With a swift motion, he pressed the detonator. There was a deafening explosion that rocked the ground beneath them. The blast was so powerful that it sent a shockwave through the tunnel, and the walls cracked and splintered as rocks fell. The explosion sent a cloud of dust and debris flying, obscuring their vision for a moment. Ryan's heart raced as the sound of the blast echoed in the cavern. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the creatures' roars filled the air as they were caught in the debris. Ryan felt a wave of relief wash over him. The explosion had worked. The tunnel was partially collapsed, blocking the creatures' path and trapping them inside. But there was no time to relax. The noise had attracted even more creatures, and the tunnel wasn't completely sealed. Ryan grabbed Zira's arm, pulling her into motion. "Let's go," he said urgently. They ran through the smoke and debris, their footsteps echoing as they moved quickly through the darkened corridors. The trap had worked, but it was only temporary. They needed to keep moving if they wanted to survive. As they rounded another corner, they saw a faint light up ahead. It was their only hope. They pushed forward, ignoring the exhaustion in their limbs. Ryan's mind raced with thoughts of what would come next, but one thing was certain: they were in this together. They had survived this far by trusting each other, and now, more than ever, they needed to stick together if they wanted to make it out alive. Ryan and Zira emerged from the wreckage, both covered in dust and debris, their clothes torn and faces marked with exhaustion. But despite the physical strain, there was something in the air that felt different. They had made it out, and now they had a chance to see what lay ahead. They stood at the entrance of the tunnel, looking out at the vast, unfamiliar landscape before them. The light of a setting sun cast a warm glow on the horizon, a stark contrast to the dark, claustrophobic world they had just escaped. It was a new beginning, but also a moment of reckoning. As Ryan took a deep breath, the weight of everything they had been through hit him. It had been a battle, fighting their way through the tunnels, facing the creatures, and dealing with the explosive trap they had set. But more than that, it had been a test of trust. They had both been forced to rely on each other, to work together when everything seemed impossible. There had been no other choice but to trust that the other would not betray them. Zura, who had been silent for a few moments, finally spoke. "You did it," she said quietly, looking at Ryan with a mix of admiration and something deeper, something that had formed between them during their shared struggles. "You saved us." Ryan turned to look at her, his gaze softening. "We saved each other," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. It had taken everything in him to keep going, to trust her when he wasn't sure if she was really on his side. But now, in the light of their survival, there was no denying the bond they had forged. They were no longer enemies, but partners, survivors of a nightmare that had seemed endless. Zara's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she turned her attention to the landscape before them. "I didn't expect this," she murmured. "I thought the world was over. I thought I would die in those tunnels. But we're here. We made it." Ryan glanced around at the unfamiliar terrain. It was a harsh, alien world, rocky and barren, but there was hope. They had survived against all odds, and in a way, that survival felt like redemption. Zira had been an enemy, a princess caught in a war she couldn't control, but now she was someone he had fought beside, someone he had trusted with his life. And in return, she had trusted him. "We did more than just survive," Ryan said, his voice growing stronger. "We've earned a second chance, a chance to build something new." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was heavy, but it wasn't the oppressive silence they had once known in the tunnels. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, the calm before something new begins. Ryan felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had always thought of himself as just a soldier, fighting for survival, but now he realized that he was more than that. He was a man who had made a choice to fight for something greater, something worth living for. Zira seemed to sense the shift in him, her gaze softening as she took a few steps toward him. "Do you think we can really do it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Build something new?" Ryan turned to face her, his expression serious. "We don't have a choice. We've already started. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone we left behind. The people who are still out there, the ones who need to know that there's hope." Zira nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I can't go back to the way things were," she said, her tone heavy with emotion. "I can't go back to being a pawn in someone else's game. I've seen too much, felt too much. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to face it alone." Ryan felt a pang in his chest. He had heard the pain in her voice, the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had been forced to endure. But there was something else there too, something that he hadn't expected. Zira wasn't the rebellious princess he had first met. She had changed, and in many ways, so had he. "You're not alone," Ryan said firmly, stepping closer to her. "We're in this together, Zira. Whatever happens next, we'll face it side by side." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the rocks around them. Then, Zira's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes softening as she met his gaze. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you," she said, her voice filled with both disbelief and gratitude. "But thank you for trusting me." Ryan shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've earned it. We've both earned it." As they stood together in the quiet of the alien world, they both knew that they had crossed a line. They had been through a trial by fire, and now there was no turning back. They had forged a bond that was stronger than any feud, any old grudge, any hatred that might have existed between them. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rebuilding, about starting over. And the path ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren land, Ryan knew that they would face many more challenges. The world they had stepped into was harsh, unforgiving, and full of dangers that could tear them apart. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Not the naive kind that comes with wishful thinking, but the real kind. The kind that comes from knowing that together they could face anything. "I'll make sure you never have to go back to that life," Ryan said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to be anyone's pawn anymore. This is your chance, Lyra. We both have a chance to change everything." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a new kind of resolve. "And I'll help you," she said, her voice stronger now. "We'll change it together." And so they began to walk forward into the unknown, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges the future would throw at them. They had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. The redemption they had earned would shape their future, and together, they would make sure that their new beginning was one worth fighting for.